All right, listeners, I think you know that we are part of the Radiotopia network, which is basically a network built on the idea that you should support the most creative, independent audio makers around. No one, and I mean no one, embodies the Radiotopia ethos more than Benjamin Walker and his show Theory of Everything. Benjamin, who I've known for a long time, has been making beautiful, personal, sprawling audio documentaries for decades that help us understand the very strange world we live in. And now he has a new series called Not All Propaganda is Art. The new series goes back to the 1950s when Western security agencies like the CIA paid artists, writers, and intellectuals to fight the cultural Cold War.
The CIA funds were free. I mean, no one was told what to say.
Gloria Steinem, activist who sees the CIA as a sort of enlightened pal or rich uncle, there is another viewpoint.
Look, if you're listening to this show, I know you like secret histories. I know you like a mix of culture and politics and shadowy figures. So what are you waiting for? Not All Propaganda is Art from Benjamin Walker. You can find it now wherever you listen or at theoryofeverythingpodcast.com. Support for This Day in Esoteric Political History comes from Odoo. What is Odoo? Well, Odoo is the only software your business will ever need. Featuring a suite of integrated business applications, Odoo connects your business operations together so you can get more done in less time. Odoo has apps for everything: CRM, accounting, sales, HR, inventory, marketing, manufacturing, you name it, Odoo's got it. To learn more, visit odoo.com/thisday. That's odoo.com/thisday. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day, September 19th, 1952, the persecution of Charlie Chaplin. The actor and comedian made his name in the 20s and 30s as a comic actor, a sort of slapstick silent film star, one of the most famous actors and celebrities in the whole world, I think it's safe to say. And that may, in many ways, still be the image people have in their heads of who Charlie Chaplin is. But just to give you a sense, listeners, of the evolution of Charlie Chaplin, at least in certain circles, by the late 1940s, a U.S. congressperson is saying things like this about Charlie Chaplin, quote, "His very life in Hollywood is detrimental to the moral fabric of America. If he is deported, his loathsome pictures can be kept from before the eyes of American youth. He should be deported and gotten rid of at once." So different stakes, certainly, than some, fun slapsticks in the 20s and 30s. And, what is at stake in this moment in 1952 is that Chaplin is on a trip abroad at sea, and the U.S. Attorney General is announcing plans to launch an inquiry into whether he should be readmitted into the United States, all around questions about whether he is un-American, a communist sympathizer, all sorts of big Red Scare questions that are swirling in the early 50s. It would, in the end, be 20 years before he would return to America. There is so much to talk about in the life of Charlie Chaplin and this moment of persecution. So here to discuss, as always, are Nicole Hammer of Columbia and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello.
Hey there.
So, I tried to give a little glimpse of the sort of many phases of Charlie Chaplin's life. I mean, as you look at him, no surprise, many, many books have been written, many documentaries, but, this is one of those characters through which you feel like you could tell the entire story almost of 20th century America. So we're focused in this moment here in the late 40s, early 50s. But, NIki, do you just have any thoughts on Chaplin in general and kind of like what his story says about us?
Yeah, we've skipped over one point in his career. You have the silent film slapstick star, and then you have the persecuted communist sympathizer. But, in 1940, he makes this film called The Great Dictator, which is kind of an Antifa film, right? He's a strong anti-fascist. He's coming out against the Hitler regime. I guess, you have the mustache already. You play the character of Hitler in this spoof comedy. Like, it's a comedy, but then it ends with this big dramatic speech in defense of democracy. And that's a really interesting moment to look back on today. But it also gets him even more on the radar of the FBI. He'd been on the FBI's radar since the FBI was founded. They were suspicious of him because he hung out with people who they considered to be radicals. And, you know, over 30 years, they amassed quite a file on him. And by 1952, they kick him out.
Yeah.
And it's crazy because I think that a lot of people don't even realize that Charlie Chaplin was not American. You know, he becomes such a major celebrity and a household name that when it comes time for him to come back to the States, people are sort of like, wait, Charlie Chaplin's not American? He's British? Like, so I think that's a huge part of the story as well, is what happens when you have these major celebrities that become a part of like pop culture in ways that it becomes difficult to see Charlie Chaplin as a foreigner.
Yeah, which, well, two things. So one is, I suppose it's easier to have people not realize you are British if you're a silent film star.
Right.
That's part of it. And then also, you know, I mean, to your point, you know, there's this question, he's not American, but the question at hand is he un-American, right? And he's, you know, an American star. He has made his name in this country. He is in this moment returning to England for the first time in a long time, actually. And he has some really interesting sort of thoughts in this moment about the United States versus England, particularly in this moment in the early 50s. But then, yes, the FBI is starting to ask some questions about him. Hoover's starting to ask some questions about him. That great dictator, which was in 1940. So, you know, we're talking now about a decade plus of Charlie Chaplin as a sort of like outspoken political figure. But that film, The Great Dictator, I mean, first off, the lampooning of Hitler, you know, was such a huge statement and moment in a sort of cultural and political sense. But then, you know, the reactions to that are just so resonant for now, because there's basically, you know, you have the whole like Colin Kaepernick, like stick to sports thing. Yeah. People were basically saying to Charlie, like, stick to comedy, right? Yeah. And saying like, no one wants to hear you preach about real issues, the end of your fun films or whatever. And you just read these quotes and they're so resonant. But it's also really interesting to me that the thing that gets Hoover to say, wait, this person might be a radical, is standing up to Hitler, right?
Right.
So it's just this really fascinating kind of thing of like, that's the thing that makes you worry. But yeah,
spend an episode on why Hoover is the worst.
Well,
might take
talk
more
about
than one
figures
episode.
who you can tell the whole history of America.
Hoover
through,
goes after everyone, so many beloved people, but for the most sort of superficial or you know, shallow reasons, we should say, but that his intent upon like targeting you ruins people's careers, it ruins people's lives. So when we think about this moment, I'm thinking in the 1940s and 50s, I'm thinking about how Hollywood is completely on edge because of the fear of being blacklisted. I think about Paul Robeson, who has his passport taken away as well. You know, Charlie Chaplin is not alone in this targeting, but I think it just goes to show you that no one was sort of above the frame, getting around, you know, Hoover's claws if he wanted to target you.
And Chaplin was targeted in that 1947 attack on Hollywood. I think we've talked here before about the Hollywood 10 and their trial. But Chaplin wasn't blacklisted because he was actually in a more independent position. He's got two sources of independence. One, he's not a U.S. citizen. He's a British citizen. But two, that he is part of the ownership structure of United Artists. So he can't be blacklisted because he's a part owner of the studio that's making his films. And that economic security and that ownership provides him with a layer of protection that so many of the people who are blacklisted didn't have. So eventually the blocking or the sort of deportation or blocking his entry back into the U.S. is their workaround for all of these forms of independence that he has.
Yeah. He was subpoenaed to appear before HUAC, the House on Un-American Activities Committee. He did not actually testify there. But yes, so that brings us to this moment in 52. He travels on September 17th to Europe to promote a new film, Limelight. You know, I think it is worth just saying, like, his popularity has waned a little bit. He's still Charlie Chaplin, but, you know, he's not as famous or notable. And some people attribute that to his being a little more political or outspoken, but I think it's also just, you know, culture changes and so forth. Nevertheless, still a big star, traveling to Europe to promote his new film, Limelight. It was his first visit back to England in 21 years. one of the last things he says when he gets on a boat to go over, he says, I'll probably be back in 6 months or so, but not any longer than that. Of course, it ends up being almost 20 years, in part because U.S. Attorney General James McGraney orders the INS to look into Chaplin and see whether he will be readmitted into the United States. And the stated justification for this inquiry was that there is law that can bar aliens on the grounds of, quote, morality, health or insanity, or for advocating communism.
Yeah, and I think that moral turpitude part of it is actually an important part of the discussion, because part of the reason that his popularity wanes in the 1940s is he's caught in the midst of this scandal where he has a relationship with a woman in her early 20s and she ends up getting pregnant, and he's kind of over the relationship. She's talking about it to the tabloids, and there's this sense that he is, in the very constricted sexual mores of the era, like someone who is not morally upright. And this does cost him some popularity with his fans. At the same time, he's making movies that are kind of anti-war and anti-nuclear weapons, and the politics and the questions of sexuality and morality are all smooshed together during this era. And so just like you have people who are being investigated because they're gay and that's considered a sign of communist leanings, his relationships are under a microscope as well. And so that's all smushed together for Chaplin and becomes part of the reason that he's kept out of the country.
And I think also part of the reason that he decides to stay and not sort of push it, because I think he could have pushed back and said, I'm going to try to get in and see what happens. But he sort of resigns himself. And one of the things that he says that to me was so remarkable was really like, talking about his dissatisfaction with the state of American politics. And so he says, whether I re-entered that unhappy country or not was of little consequence to me. I would have liked to told them that sooner I was rid of that hate-beleaguered atmosphere, the better, and that I was fed up with America's insults and moral pomposity. So, at this point, Chaplin's pretty fed up. He's like, fine, I won't come back, and I don't want to come back to a climate like this. And so he stays gone for pretty much the rest of his life.
But, most of his property is still back in the United States. Mm-hmm. He has to kind of walk this line where he can't just fully cut ties because, he's made his life and his business in the United States. So, privately, I think he's fed up, as I think a lot of people are.
Yeah, this is not a public statement he's making. It's a private.
And I guess, we've talked about this before, not just with this era, but with a lot of these sort of moments of persecution and panic and so forth. But Kellie, it's the chilling effect that is really the thing here, right? In the end, there is not really any, not that you could even do it, but any real hard evidence of moral turpitude or communist sympathies or whatever. But it's really this thread of inquiry and these rumors that really, in the end, those are the things that have an effect regardless of whether there's evidence to back it up or not.
Yeah. And I think for Chaplin, it's like, it's the betrayal for me. It's the I have been loyal to this country. I've made a home in this country. I have been in this country longer than he had in London or in Great Britain. And so for him, for America to turn its back on him, it really soured relationships and made it difficult for him to see America as his home.
And not just turning their back on him, but turning their back on his art as well. You mentioned that Limelight was the film that he was going off to promote, which was very well received in Europe. And in the U.S., it was basically blackballed. There were boycotts of theaters across the country. They weren't showing his movies. So in a way, like, not only was he purged from the country, but he was purged from the culture.
Mm.
And so then he stays in exile basically for 20 years or so, and then comes back in the 70s, and then he dies in the late 70s. But again, he dies in his 80s. Again, you can track so much of the story of this century, of the 20th century, through Charlie Chaplin. But as is the case in a lot of these incidents, we don't really get the full picture until documents are declassified. Stuff starts to come out decades and decades later. So it's really in the 80s, 90s, even into the 2000s that we start to see a declassification here. One of the things we learn, as I said before, to reiterate, is that they didn't really have hard evidence that would have barred him from coming back. If he had applied to come back, he probably would have gained re-entry, it seems. But again, the goal was to, I think, probably just have this chilling effect, make him fed up, and in the end, he didn't come back. And so, I guess the FBI wins in that way.
In 1972, though, he does come back to receive an Oscar, an honorary award. He had been living in Switzerland for a while. I think the Oscars are always a reason to come back. So he comes back to get his award. But, but so much has passed. And it's also interesting that the climate has shifted, because when he comes to the stage to receive his honorary Oscar, he gets a 12-minute standing ovation. So it lets you know that even though he was far away, people were still thinking about him and the work that he had done and the contributions that he had made to Hollywood.
Yeah, a lot easier to do 30 years later.
Yeah.
Once the fever has broken. Well, there was one other interesting find in the declassification. In 2003, the British Foreign Office declassified some of its records, and it turns out that the person who narked on Charlie Chaplin and saying he was a secret communist and a friend of the Soviet Union was George Orwell. He had submitted this secret list of secret communists to the Secret Government Bureau, which I have to say sounds pretty Orwellian.
And there you go. Yeah, that's. I had no idea about that. We might need to do a proper episode on that, even though it was in England. But my God, yeah, George Orwell ratting out 35 people and creating a list is something else.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I think we can leave Charlie Chaplin there. I do want to do a few also on this days as we wrap up here. So we're looking at September 19th here. In 1881, this is when James Garfield died of his wounds. So we did an episode of that a couple weeks ago. That's how long James Garfield lived after being shot. And now he finally dies on September 19th. We got an email from listener Colin, who suggested an episode on this day in 1985 when Frank Zappa, John Denver, and Dee Snider appeared in front of the Senate to defend artistic freedom. That is an incredible moment. We got to look back into that and find another reason to talk about Zappa, Denver, and Dee Snider.
Not the pairing that you often see in a musical list.
And perhaps, I think, maybe not the most convincing group. Or maybe John Denver. Maybe the Senate was sympathetic to John Denver, but I don't know if Zappa and Dee Snider were really,
my understanding is that they were extremely eloquent in their defense of musical freedom.
Well, Frank Zappa, a very, very smart guy. And 2010, this was the day that the BP oil well spill finally came to an end. They put a cement plug over the top of it. My one take on the BP oil spill was that was the moment that, like, September of 2010 was one of the moments for me when I started to feel like, oh, there's too much news in the world. And I just remember the BP oil spill, and there were like 5 or 6 other things going on, but there was just a stretch in 2010, 2011, which no coincidence was sort of when the rise of Twitter was coming along. But I just remember feeling like, how can there be this many major stories to try and keep up with at any given moment? So that's my kind of one bigger thought on that. Fall of 2010.
It was one of those things that absolutely tortured the Obama administration because they could not stop the leak, and cable news just had video of oil spilling into the Gulf every single moment of every single day. It was a rough spell for that administration.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. And then I think it was shortly thereafter the Arab Spring took off, and then it was like Fukushima was in. It was just like this thing where it's like
it's been chaos ever
since. That's right. This is the origin moment when the hell mouth opened.
There you go. Yeah, there's a good theory. All right. That brings us to the end of the episode. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thanks, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, listener-supported, artist-owned podcasts. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. Kaula Nakua helps with transcripts. Julie Shapiro is executive producer for Radiotopia. Get in touch with us if you have any questions or comments or ideas for the show. You can email us thisdaypod@gmail.com, or you can find a form at thisdaypod.com, where you can also get our full archives, transcripts, and learn lots more about the show. Follow us on social at thisdaypod on Instagram and Twitter, where we are posting stuff each and every day. My name is Jody Avergan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.
You, the people, have the power to make this life free and beautiful, to make this life a wonderful adventure. Then in the name of democracy, let us use that power. Let us all unite.
Radiotopia.